Picture a warplane sitting behind museum glass. Thousands of visitors walk past it every year, snapping photos, marveling at the machine that once ruled the skies. But the man who donated it hasn't set foot in that museum in 30 years. Why? Because the son of the enemy pilot he shot down in that very aircraft now works at that same museum. And to this day, neither man has ever spoken the other's name out loud. Not knowing what the other one carries, stay until the end, because when these two men finally meet, it happens in a way you will not see coming. Before we get into it, if stories like this move you, hit subscribe and drop a like. It helps these forgotten stories reach the people who need to hear them. Now let's begin. In the official files, his name was written simply as Captain Robert Hale. Nobody who read those files would have guessed the weight the name carried. It was 1968. Robert was 32 years old, strapped into the cockpit of an F-4 Phantom, watching a single blip crawl across his radar screen. That blip was a MiG-21, and inside that MiG-21 sat a man 6 years younger than himself, a pilot named Hung Van Than. Though Robert would not learn that name for another 5 decades, the entire engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. Robert fired. Than's aircraft became a fireball and dropped out of the sky, trailing smoke toward the jungle below. When Robert returned to base that afternoon, there was already a celebration waiting. Men lifted him onto their shoulders. Someone handed him a drink before his boots even touched the tarmac. He smiled because that was what you did. But that night, lying on his cot, staring at the ceiling of the barracks, he could not sleep. Earlier that day, the radio intercept team had picked up a fragment of transmission from the falling MiG in its final seconds, a broken, garbled sound, barely a voice at all. Maybe a name, maybe a prayer. Robert never found out which, and the not knowing followed him home. He finished his tour and flew back to the United States. He married. He raised 2 children. He built a modest, respectable life, the kind of life that from the outside looked entirely at peace. He worked as an airline mechanic for 30 years, coached his son's baseball team, mowed his lawn every Saturday morning. Neighbors described him as quiet, reliable, the sort of man you'd trust with a spare key to your house. Nobody knew that somewhere underneath that quiet reliability, there was a single unanswered question that never stopped circling. Who was the man whose voice vanished into that static, and who did he leave behind? Robert never spoke about the war unless someone asked directly. And even then, he gave the shortest possible answer and changed the subject. His wife learned early on not to push. His children grew up knowing their father had been a fighter pilot, that there was a folded flag in a shadow box of medals in the hall closet, and that this was not a subject you brought up at the dinner table. It wasn't shame, exactly, that kept him silent. It was something closer to a wound that had scarred over but never actually stopped hurting when it pressed on in 2019. At 83 years old, Robert made a decision his family had been gently encouraging for years. He donated nearly everything connected to his service to the Regional Air Force Museum, a few hours from his home: his uniform, his medals, his logbooks, and the centerpiece of it all, the actual F-4 Phantom he had flown, which had sat disassembled in a storage hangar for over 50 years, and was now fully restored by the museum's team. The curators were thrilled. A donation of this scale, with a fully documented combat history and a living veteran attached to it, was rare. They planned an opening ceremony in his honor, sent invitations to his entire extended family, arranged for local press to cover it. Robert declined the invitation. He told them over the phone that his health wasn't what it used to be, that the drive was too long, that he hoped they'd understand. His daughter offered to drive him herself. He told her the same thing. Everyone accepted the explanation because it was plausible, and because nobody wanted to press an 83-year-old man on his reasons for not wanting to travel. The real reason was simpler and far heavier than any of that. Seeing that aircraft again, in person, meant reliving the 3 minutes that had quietly shaped the rest of his life. It meant standing in front of physical proof of the day he had ended someone else's life and never learned who that someone was. He had spent 50 years building distance between himself and that cockpit. He wasn't ready to close it, even for an afternoon, even for his own family. 3 years after the donation, a young historian was hired onto the museum's curatorial staff. His name was Michael Hung. His mother was Vietnamese, and she had come to the United States in the years after the war, pregnant and alone. Without ever having recovered her husband's body or learned exactly how he died, she raised Michael by herself in a small apartment outside of Sacramento, working double shifts at a hospital laundry service, and she rarely spoke about his father, except to say that he had been a pilot, that he had been brave, and that the sky had taken him before Michael was born. Michael grew up with a photograph on the living room shelf of a young man in uniform he had never met, and a persistent, quiet ache where a father should have been. He studied history in college, focused eventually on aviation and the Vietnam War specifically, though he never fully admitted to himself or to his mother that part of the reason was the hope that somewhere in the archives of that war, he might stumble across a piece of the father he never had. He took the job at the museum for the salary and the subject matter, not realizing what was waiting for him in the building's back rooms. Several months into the job, while cataloging a shipment of old flight records that had come in along with Robert's donation, Michael began cross-referencing engagement logs, tail numbers, and dates as part of a routine digitization project. It was tedious work, the kind most people would rush through. Michael did not rush. He noticed a serial number that matched the aircraft on display in the main hall, and beside it, a logged engagement from 1968, listing a confirmed kill against a North Vietnamese MiG-21, the pilot of record, Hale. He didn't go home that night. He sat in the archive room for hours, pulling every related document he could find, comparing flight dates, radar logs, squadron assignments, cross-checking them against the fragmented records his mother had given him years earlier, records she had obtained decades ago through a veterans outreach program, trying to help Vietnamese families locate information about missing husbands and sons. Piece by piece, the dates lined up, the coordinates lined up, and slowly, unmistakably, Michael understood. The aircraft he walked past every single day, the one he had personally helped clean and prep for the museum floor, the one visitors admired and photographed constantly, was the very aircraft that had shot down his father. He sat with that knowledge for nearly 2 weeks before he told anyone. He wasn't angry, which surprised him. He kept waiting for the anger to arrive, and it never quite did. What arrived instead was something closer to a hollow, urgent need, not for confrontation, but for information. He wanted, more than anything else, to talk to the man who had been in that cockpit, just once. Just to ask him what he remembered. Through the museum's donor relations office, Michael sent a short, careful letter to Robert's home address. It read simply, "I would like to speak with you for a few minutes, about my father." Robert left the letter unopened on his kitchen table for 3 days. His wife had passed years earlier, and he lived alone now, which meant there was no one to ask him why he kept walking past an envelope without touching it. On the 4th day, he finally opened it, read the single paragraph twice, and sat very still in his chair for a long time. Then he called his grandson and asked him for a ride to the museum the following weekend. He hadn't stepped inside in 3 years. Walking through the front doors, he felt his chest tighten before he even reached the main hall. And then there it was, his aircraft, fully restored, gleaming under the exhibit lights, exactly as he remembered it, and nothing like he remembered it at all. Standing beside it, waiting, was a man in his early 30s. Dressed in the plain button-down of museum staff, with a stillness in his posture that Robert recognized immediately. Though he couldn't have said from where. Michael introduced himself. Robert introduced himself back. Neither man extended a hand right away. "My father's name was Thanh," Michael said finally. I wanted to ask you something. On that day, did he say anything? At the end, Robert's hands began to tremble slightly, something Michael noticed but didn't comment on. Robert explained, haltingly, about the radio intercept from that afternoon in 1968. The fragment of transmission the listening post had recorded before the connection dropped into static. He explained that he had requested a copy of that recording years later, through channels that had taken him almost a decade to work through, and that once he finally received it, he had never once played it. It sat in a small metal box in his closet, wrapped in a plastic sleeve, for over 40 years. I kept it, Robert said. I never listened to it. I couldn't. That evening, in a back room of the museum, surrounded by filing cabinets and archival boxes, two men who had never met before that afternoon, one who had pulled the trigger, and one who was the son of the man on the other end of it, sat down together and listened to a recording that waited half a century to be heard. The audio was rough, cut through with static, barely intelligible in most places. But one part of it came through with startling clarity, a name, spoken clearly in the middle of the noise, a woman's name. Michael recognized it instantly. It was his mother's name, 48 years after her husband disappeared from the sky. Michael's mother finally learned, through her son, that the last thing her husband said before he died was her own name. Robert began visiting the museum regularly after that day. He no longer looks away when he walks past the aircraft. He and Michael have spoken many times since. Not about blame, and not really about forgiveness either, but about what it means to carry someone else's absence for decades without knowing their face or their name. Today, when Michael gives tours through that exhibit hall, he doesn't just recite the technical history of the aircraft on display. He tells visitors the rest of it too, the story of two families connected by 3 minutes in the sky over 50 years ago, and the long, quiet distance it took for both of them to finally hear each other. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments which moment hit you hardest. We'll see you in the next one.